Hey there, Metal here from WebDevFuel, and in this video I'm going to react to part of a podcast that was recorded by the Primagen, TJ, and also Mitchell Hashimoto, and I'm going to give my opinion related to Go. So if you don't know, Mitchell recently built a newly released terminal, Ghosty, and he's using Zig to build that terminal, and he also has been using for a lot of years Go, and not at the moment, so he sort of switched from Go to Zig, and he's going to give his opinion here in this part of the interview. So I'm going to react to this, and then we'll comment on part of this interview.
Like, would you write? So you've written a lot of Go. I know that. Do you think you'd write Go differently now, like after writing so much Zig, or do you feel like, oh, Go is designed around this interface idea, so I would keep writing interfaces?
Man, I've never thought about that. I don't think I could write Go again right now.
Well, I assume Zig would just not be that great. Like, if you had to write a server, I would assume you'd much rather reach for Go than reach for Zig. Just cut.
Yeah, so like I was saying, Mitchell has been writing Go for a lot of years, and he built one of his companies that he's a co-founder in, HashiCorp, with Go. So a lot of the stack, as far as I'm aware, over there is with Go, and he's been using it for a lot of years. And since he's done this transition over to Zig, he's saying here that he doesn't really know if he can even go back to using Go. And the point here that the Primagen is making, I think, makes a lot of sense, that even though Zig is good for a lot of things when it comes to low-level programming, I think that Go still has its place in the stack. And yeah, so they are going to comment a bit more on this, and we'll continue after listening to the rest.
I assume Zig would just not be that great. Like, if you had to write a server, I would assume you'd much rather reach for Go than reach for Zig, just because of like the highly asynchronous nature. And Zig isn't necessarily fun making a bunch of calls and aligning stuff.
Maybe I'm like ill or something, but I think I would just use like PHP or something. Like I don't know. I'm questioning everything about Go's place in the stack because I'm like, on one hand you have Rust and things like Zig for the actual like performance critical like core components, and that could expose C APIs and things like that, and you could guarantee safety on the Rust side, things like that. And then you have this move fast and break things web thing where I'm like, do you just want PHP or Rails or something? Like I don't know.
Yeah, so this is where I think that I really don't agree with this part. I totally understand the reason for choosing Zig to build something like a terminal, and I don't really think that Go would be a good choice at all when it comes to building something like that. So everything that is very low level and works at the OS level, I think that you should choose something like Rust, Zig, C, C++, those kinds of languages. And then for things on the server, I still think that Go has its place, specifically when it comes to doing networking things, when it comes to doing communication between different services, and especially when it comes to multi-core things. So let's continue with the rest, and then I'm going to show you sort of a diagram where I compare different languages, and I show you in more detail exactly where I think that Go still fits in inside of the ecosystem of the web development ecosystem or programming in general. So we'll take a look at those details in just a second.
I love Go, the community and things like that, but yeah, I'm in a weird place with it right now.
I love that not only did you just kind of just wreck Go there for a quick second, you also conspicuously left JavaScript out of the list of dynamic languages. Like, there's so many good things with this entire rant that just went on.
Yeah, okay, so let's hop into the diagram, and then I'm going to explain exactly, again, why I don't really agree with this thing and where I think that Go fits into this entire puzzle. Okay, so let's imagine that we have two different axes, and here at the top, we're going to say that we have here things that are local. So let's imagine things that happen inside of a machine, whether that's local to you or local to a machine in the cloud. We're going to say that we want this to be things that are local. And then here at the bottom, we have things that interact with a network. So things that need to speak to different services, things that need to communicate with services, aggregate data, and in general need to do communication. So for example, if you have different machines running on a hosting provider and you want to have communication between them, or if you have one API and for example a microservice that does something specific, in those kinds of situations we can think of those things as something that interacts with the network. And then in this axis we're going to have things that are simple and then things that are complex. So the best way that I can explain this to you is that things that are complex from a engineering standpoint. So if you are implementing something that has a lot of complexity when it comes to either the local part of things or the networking part of things, then you're going to have things that are difficult to program, have a lot of details that are important to them. They have to work correctly. And examples that I can give you of this are, for example, databases, or even like distributed systems. So if you have something, for example, a WebSocket server that needs to communicate between different instances and send messages across different servers and then communicate back to the client, those kinds of things would be considered, in my mind, things that are complex. And then things that are simple would be things like a web application. And even though this can be considered something that is complex, so it actually has a lot of functionality and those kinds of things, I mean that it is simple from the implementer standpoint. So the person that is programming, the programmer, the web developer, doesn't have to do a lot of work when it comes to those kinds of things. So if you are building, for example, a web application and you choose, for example, to build it with Laravel or with Rails, then you only need to care about the simple things, quote unquote. They are not actually simple, but compared to other things which are a bit more complex when it comes to implementing them as a programmer. So a database, for example, we can think of SQLite or PostgreSQL, things like that. Those are on the complex side. So if we think about both of these axes, here's where I think that Go fits, and also other languages like Node.js, PHP. Node.js is not actually a language, I meant JavaScript, PHP Laravel, and also Zig or Rust. So if you want to build something that is local and is simple, I would say that the language that you should choose would be something like JavaScript with Node.js, or even a language like Python. So what I mean by this is, let's say you have a CLI that you want to build for automating things inside of your local machine or inside of a different machine without having to communicate with the outside world or have to do a lot of things when it comes to networking. In those cases, I think that if you know how to use JavaScript, if you know how to use Python, you don't need to go to a more complex language. Obviously, if you are proficient with Go, for example, or with Rust, and you prefer to use them over these languages, then I think that you can still use those languages. That's fine. But what I mean here is that these are languages that are good enough for these kinds of things, and they fit well into these kinds of examples because they are simple languages. So if you choose to use Python, you don't have to do a lot of setup when it comes to setting up a CLI. And also with Node.js and JavaScript, you also don't have to do a lot of setup. You don't have necessarily types. If you choose to use TypeScript, then you have them, but you can go with JavaScript only, and you don't need to even think about the types. So in these kinds of cases, I think that both of these languages are really nice. Obviously, they also fit into other paradigms, into other ecosystems. So JavaScript in the browser, obviously that's something that you'll always be using. Python with, for example, artificial intelligence, also something that you'll end up using, and you can't really run away from them in these situations. But they are perfect for these kinds of things if you want to again build something that is local and simple. Now, if you want to build something that is local but is complex, then you cannot use JavaScript or Python. So if you want to build a database, if you want to build a CLI that needs to be very performant, so let's think things that need to be as fast as possible. So you want, for example, to cat a file. If you want to build a clone of cat or for example, FD, which is an alternative to the find command, is built in Rust. Those kinds of local tools that we use inside of our machines, whether we interact with them as developers or whether they are just tools that are used by other applications that are built locally inside of a machine. In those cases, we want them to be as fast as possible. They need to be performant, and we cannot use languages like JavaScript or Python. So in these cases, I would say that Zig makes a lot of sense. Rust also makes a lot of sense. So Mitchell is now building a terminal that I'm using currently, Ghosty, and it makes a lot of sense to use Zig in this type of web application. So you wouldn't use, for example, Go. I think wouldn't be a good use case for it. JavaScript and Python also obviously no. And in that kind of situation, it makes a lot of sense to use these kinds of languages. We can also add here C or even, for example, C++. And then we have here at the bottom, so we have here the complex things, the simple, and then we have local and network. And here's where I think that Go truly shines. So if we have something that is simple and needs to interact with the network, we're going to take a look at that in just a second. But if we have something that is complex and needs to interact with the network, then I think Go is perfect over here. And I don't really think there is another language that is as good as Go for these kinds of things. So if we were to choose something like Zig or Rust in these kinds of situations, the ecosystem and the community and the way to even do things like concurrency or multi-threading and the simplicity of the language wouldn't allow us to really build something with the language that was very good. So if we were to think, for example, of Rust is being today used for a lot of things in the web development tooling ecosystem, but it is not really being used for a lot of things when it comes to the backend. There are specific parts that are very, for example, need to be as performant as possible. So we can think of, for example, Cloudflare. They use Rust in specific parts of their stack to ensure that it works as fast as possible. But that's not really a necessity for most of the things that we are building. And that's something that is more low level. And even though it interacts with the network, I think that, again, we don't need that kind of control over the performance of our program all the time, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense to choose these kinds of languages for those kinds of things all the time. So here, when it comes to complex things using the network, Go is perfect. If we think about tools like Docker, Kubernetes, we can even think about, for example, HashiCorp. They have a lot of so for example, Terraform and other tools that are used in the web development ecosystem, especially in the backend when it comes to tooling, when it comes to doing, for example, distributed things. So for example, Kubernetes. In those situations, Go is perfect and it makes a lot of sense. Why? Because first of all, it is simple, and second of all, it has a very good concurrency model. So we can do concurrency, take advantage of multiple cores inside of a machine. So a lot of these things on the server, and usually when we talk about the server, it also requires a lot of communication, so networking. In those kinds of situations, I think that Go truly shines. Examples of this besides Docker would be, for example, if you were to build a runner. So let's say that you want to implement a custom runner that is able to grab code, for example, from a repo and then run some tests. You would want to take advantage, for example, of Docker. And since Docker is built with Go, all of the tooling around Docker is much robust if you were to use it with Go than with other SDKs, for example, for Node.js or for Python. Other than this, Go also has error as values, which is something that other languages that are more dynamic don't have. So if we were to think of languages like JavaScript and Python, which don't have errors as values, and Go has them, it makes creating programs that are robust much simpler compared to throwing errors and having to catch them. Finally, we have this side of the axis, a simple program that needs to interact with the network, and here is where I agree. Laravel, Rails, and those kinds of things make a lot of sense. So I'm going to put here Rails. So let's say Ruby, we can use Rails, and then we also have PHP, usually with Laravel. So in these kinds of programs. So if we were to build something, for example, that was a simple CRUD web application that doesn't need to do a lot of background jobs, that doesn't need to have, for example, WebSockets, that doesn't need to communicate with a lot of third-party services, in these kinds of situations, I would choose Laravel or Rails. So if we were to choose something like this, we would already have, for example, the entire skeleton of a web application. We would have authentication already built in, things like authorization also, connections to databases, an ORM. All of these things are already built in, and it makes a lot of sense to choose these tools. But if we were to, like I said, try to build something that is a bit more complex, so let's say that you wanted to implement your own background job service, let's say you wanted to build something that was a bit more different than the solutions out there in both of these ecosystems. In those situations, you wouldn't really be able to choose Ruby or PHP to build something like that and ensure that it is performant and ensure that you have the proper tools to build it in a simple way. That's just the truth. Go has a lot of basic functionality of the language that enables us to write concurrent programs, to write things like WebSocket servers that are very performant and also very simple to create, even when compared to Rails or Laravel. And also to this point, I think that in a recent video, even the Primeagen said that it was confusing for him to have to use Laravel and then have to run the WebSocket server in a different server altogether. And that is not usually the case with Go. We have the ability to build it ourselves. We have all of the building blocks to build a WebSocket server, and as a result, we can have our API, and then also part of that program can be can have endpoints that works with WebSockets. And while we could argue that it is better to split that into a different service, it doesn't always make a lot of sense, and I believe that maybe PHP took that decision for other reasons other than performance, but I think that was probably one of the reasons is because it doesn't have the best concurrency model, so it maybe has more trouble keeping the main web application performant while also having a WebSocket connections open inside the same server. So this is it. This is the reason that I think Go still has its place in the programming ecosystem, in the web development ecosystem, even with languages like Zig. And while I like Zig, and I'm even learning Zig on the side by building personal projects, I don't think that it replaces quote-unquote Go, and I don't think that the reason we now have Zig makes it that we either choose Zig or choose Ruby or PHP. I think there is this middle ground where we are not building just CRUD web applications, and we want to build something a bit more complex on the server, to have more communication between different threads, in this case Go routines, and take advantage of multiple cores. And I think that's where Go truly shines. Now, if you choose to use Go to still build APIs, to also build CRUD web applications, I think that's still fine. And in the same way, if you choose to use Ruby or PHP to build WebSocket servers, again, I also think that's completely fine. But these languages have its strengths and its weaknesses, and as a result, they are good for specific kinds of things that we are trying to build, and they are not a one size fits all. So JavaScript is good for some things, like I said, the browser. Python is good for some things, artificial intelligence. Zig, Rust, C or C++ are very good for performant programs that run on a machine, and Ruby, PHP, more specifically Rails and Laravel, are very good for building web applications without having to think about all of the details. They already have a lot of things built in, and Go is very good to build things on the backend, on the server, that need to be performant. If we are looking for a simple language, a language that is concurrent, and a language that allows us to build more complex things on the server, especially if we are building things in the web development ecosystem. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.